Well, as we know this morning, folks, we are in the last and final lesson that we have for unit number 2. As we know, unit 2 had 6 lessons that all fall under the heading of obedience in worship. When it comes to worship, we all know the definition and meaning of worship because we have covered that, I think, just about each and every week. Even last week when we did our review, or some may call it a quiz, we covered worship at that point. So there's no need to go back over what worship is all about. But we do know all of our lessons have dealt with worship. In Unit 2, you remember the first lesson dealt with obedience and that of respect. Our following lesson dealt with obedience in worshiping God. But I like what how the writer put it. He says, worshiping God alone. Then we follow that up with obedience in building the tabernacle. Followed by our next lesson was obedience on the Day of Atonement. And then we had the lesson of last week, which was obedience in offerings. And today we're dealing with obedience in feasts. You know, when I looked at the lesson this morning, I immediately thought about several other lessons that we had. If you remember, we had a lesson that was entitled, I think that was Unit 1, Obedient to Remember. And that lesson dealt with, you remember, it dealt with the Passover meal being celebrated. But as you recall, the writer covered in great detail I guess you would call it the ordinance, or the ceremonial part of the Passover, but they really didn't explain in detail the meaning of Passover. It just talked about the things that you do to properly prepare for it. And then even with the Day of Atonement, which was their most sacred of days, the writer talked about all the things that was involved in carrying it out and the things that you did, but it really didn't cover in detail what it was all about. And then even last week's lesson, you remember we dealt with the offerings, obedience and offerings. The writer covered how you bring an offering and so on from there, but he really didn't cover in detail the importance of the offering. And today's lesson, you'll find if you look at it, he follows that same concept. It deals with it's called obedience in feast, but it deals with this festival that's going on. It talks about all the things that you do and how it is to be carried out, but really doesn't cover in detail why you're doing it in the first place. And I think I finally figured it out why they've gone this route. Because in previous lessons that we've had that dealt with some of these subjects, the writer covered the true meaning of it, but didn't cover how you carry it out. It looks like this time around the writer has decided to go in the route of this is how you carry things out, but he's allowing the facilitator or the teacher to explain the true meaning of it. And you'll find today that's mostly where I'm going to come from, which is the true meaning. Because for those of you, I hope, has everybody read the lesson? If you read the lesson, all he's talking about is how do you carry things out. And if you look closely, it might be verse 38, 39, or somewhere in that area, 37. If you look, he's really repeating himself in the second half of the lesson. Just that what he does is he goes more into details about it. The first part, he just highlights things. Then the second part, he breaks it down into details, but really doesn't cover in detail the true meaning of it. So my main focus today is really to cover, I could say, the meaning of the whole lesson. So with that being said, going over these scriptures, we might have a lesson that's going to last, let's say, 45 minutes, or it might last 30 minutes. Because some things you can't go in detail. Like when it says on the 15th day of the 7th month, or I think they call it Tishra, you got to celebrate it. Well, how much can you say about that? He just gave you the date. So he just telling you how do you carry it out. But nevertheless, we are still going to cover this lesson and get a true understanding of what really they're all about. For those of you who may be using a Bible, we're coming this morning out of Leviticus. Leviticus, the 23rd chapter, starting at verse 33. Leviticus, as we know, is the third book of the Bible. It's the third book of a series of 5 books known as the Law. Leviticus, by definition, it means the words of the priests or the law of the priests. Why they call it the words of the priests or the law of the priests, because you'll find when you read it, pretty much all they talk about is things that are in the law. And one thing I want to point out about the law is this. Typically, when you think about a law, what's the first thing that comes to mind for us? When somebody says something, the law, what does the law mean? What comes to mind? Somebody brings up the law. Right. It tells you what to do and what not to do. A lot of folks look at the law when it comes to the Bible as basic prohibitions. In other words, this is what you cannot do. You can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this. But you'll find the children of Israel, they took great pride in the law because it was a guide of how they were to conduct their lives. It did a lot more than say what you couldn't do, because when you break things down, you'll find he told you, this is how you are to worship. When you come to worship, this is how you are to prepare yourself. This is how you are to sanctify yourself. This is how you are to groom yourself. It talks about this is what you do to help your neighbor out. The widows that are alone and don't have source of income, this is what you are to do to help them out. You also take up offerings for this and that. So there's a lot of things that were involved to show them how they were to conduct their lives, and you find in Leviticus. Now, Leviticus comes from the root word of Levi. And we all know Levi was the third son born to Jacob and first true wife, Leah. And the reason why I say the first wife or true wife, because that was the first one he married. Now, of course, we know that he had 12 sons, we always talk about, and one daughter, 13 kids. But you'll find if you look back, he had 13 kids by 4 different wives. 4 different wives. But Levi was the third one born, and the tribe of Levi is known as what kind of a tribe? The priestly tribe. Sometimes people, when they say priestly tribe, know what they think? All of them were priests. But really, the term they're using there when they say the priestly tribe, it just means they are a holy tribe. They are sanctified. They are set apart. It doesn't mean that all of them are priests. Now, keep in mind, all priests are Levites, but not all Levites are priests. Most of the people in the tribe of Levi were more of, I guess you'd call them Wallace trustees, deacons, that certain thing. The true priests came in the line of Moses' brother Aaron. So anybody in Aaron's family were the priests. Now, Aaron was a Levite himself also. But that's where the term itself comes from. But in today's lesson, you'll find that it's a key lesson. It deals with obedience in feast. The children of Israel had many feasts, as we know, many feasts. But this lesson here is a little bit different than others. Why I say that is, you remember we dealt with the Day of Atonement, and I said the Day of Atonement for them is their most sacred day. Then I asked the question, what is your most sacred day? If I'm not mistaken, Helen, you said every day for you is the most sacred day. Some say the most sacred day is Christmas. Some say the most sacred day is Resurrection Sunday. My response was that you'll find that individually we have sacred days, but not collectively. And what I mean by that is that the children of Israel, all of them knew that this was their sacred day. But for us, we don't have collectively as a nation of people to say this is the most sacred days. You'll find, let's say, the big one, Christmas. For us, it's a sacred day. But for the world, it's the most celebrated day. But many of them look at it as being sacred. You know, you can use Thanksgiving as the same fashion. You can use Resurrection Sunday in the same way. Because I always say of Thanksgiving, which is coming up soon, what's the first thing you hear about Thanksgiving? Jesus said being thankful. I don't travel in your circles then. The circles I travel in, Thanksgiving coming, and friends say, who house you eating at? They don't talk about being thankful. I mean, you might talk about that around the table. But initially, everybody's thinking about a meal. TV, what do they advertise? Buying food and so on and so on. The games coming on and so on from there. But thankful only comes from people such as yourselves. You meet, you celebrate, you have a good time, don't you? But also you say we're thankful what the Lord has done for us. So that's what I mean by sometimes individually we have sacred days, but sometimes not collectively we have sacred days. But this day, you'll find, this feast they're dealing with is different. It's a sacred day, and it is the most celebrated of days. This feast we're dealing with today, you'll find that, oh my goodness, I can't remember which one it was now. Deuteronomy, just trust me, it's in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy, they talk about this feast before it happens. In Deuteronomy, God says this, you are to rejoice and you are to celebrate it. Everybody get that? He said you are to rejoice and celebrate. So what does celebration mean? Yeah, have a good time with it. And you can have a good time in the Lord, can't you? Yes, you can. Now, there's a right way to do it. You can have a good time in the Lord. Last week, we celebrated what? And did we not celebrate? But we celebrated in the Lord and had a good time with it. A lot of this lesson today I might even cross-reference with our celebration. But you'll find in starting out in Leviticus 23:33, the writer starts off by saying, "And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying." We've seen this quite a bit, haven't we? And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying. But the question I have for you, who's writing this? Who wrote this? And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying. Should be an easy one, guys. Moses wrote it. Yep, Moses wrote it. And all the time we look at it and say, Moses wrote these words, and the Lord spake to Moses, saying, and keep going from there. But I tend to dwell a little bit deeper. Why did Moses write it in the first place? You'll find that he wrote it because of the fact this feast that's coming up, he's speaking of, is a perpetual feast. In other words, it is put in place to continue each and every year on this particular day. And they were not to forget it. Because one thing about it you'll find is this. History can be, what's a good term to use here? I guess you could say fickle to a certain degree. If it's given, like we know our history. Let me try to tie in the celebration. Brown Grove history. How did we initially know about Brown Grove history or know about Brown Grove history? Word of mouth. This one will tell this one something, and they'll pass it down and pass it down and pass it down. But you know, Butch, when somebody tells you something, then you tell that person, then they tell somebody something, and they tell this person something. Is it going to be the same thing in the end? It may not be. Now, the foundation may be there, but you'll find it may change somewhat. Case in point, with Brown Grove and dealing with the preservation group and even with the church itself, the history had to be known. We know the foundation of the history, but they canvassed the community. And they talked to the elders who things were passed down to. And you'll find that once they got the information from them, I guess you could say, I'm going to speak my own words here, they composed it in the most accurate way that they could so you would know the history. Now, even with that being said, I've had individuals say, well, they said this, and that. But that ain't how it happened. This went on so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so. You know my response was, in kindness, we need to go and tell somebody on the committee those exact same words. Because that was the whole purpose of coming through the community, seeing people in the first place based upon what they know. I said, but keep in mind, when you have oral history and 5 people over here say one thing, and then let's say you or one other says something different, there might be some validity to it, but it's 4-1. So what the information you got may be the one that's off. But you have to give it in the most accurate way that you can. So the best way to record your history is to guess what? Write it down. Write it down because it doesn't change to write it down. Everything that of great importance that Moses had, he wrote it down. And he wrote it down in fashion by saying, and the Lord spake unto Moses, saying. So he wrote it out for you to know it. It's no different than, because if you write it out, it doesn't change. It's like being at that church meeting. They take what we call what? What we call it? Take notes, but we take minutes. And what do they say walls in the end? Do we accept the minutes, have a motion, accept the minutes as read? And someone will say, second it. All those in favor? And it's done. You can't come back to the next meeting and they're read and you're saying, but no, they got that wrong. It's like, no, we agreed upon it and this is what it was. So Moses just does the exact same thing here. He records it for history's sake. Why? Because this is mandated each and every year, they had to have this celebration, and they had to tell why they were having it in the first place. 152 years, each time we have an anniversary, what's read? The history. And I think from this day forward, it may be even in more and greater detail because of the things that have come out through this last process of getting things together. But you could almost say with our anniversary, it's perpetual. It doesn't change, does it? Each and every year is brought forth. And you could almost say, in relation to this lesson, we're called upon to celebrate it. Celebrate it in the Lord. So Moses says here, and the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, speak unto the children of Israel, saying, the 15th day of this 7th month shall be the feast of tabernacles for 7 days unto the Lord. So what he does now is gives a date of when this is to take place each and every year on the 15th day of the 7th month. Now, for them, the time frame is really about because their months overlap ours. It's more like September, October. And the reason why they are having it now, because this is late fall. It's late winter. So in other words, it is the last of the harvest. The harvest now is taken up. So they know each and every year around this time, this is when you are to have it. There's certain things that go on, certain crops you plant certain times of the year. You can't go any time past that, because if you do, they might not survive. We know crops, typically, by this time frame, all is done. It's like now we're in the season of frost hits the ground. Grass not going to grow too much anymore, is it? Doesn't work that way. Every year things about the same. Mostly guys do this, not trying to be male chauvinistic here, but guys tend to get up leaves, don't they? Leaves. Every year you get your leaves up, don't you? And at my house, it's like clockwork. Some of us, I stopped using my mower last month. I said, well, I don't stop using my mower until about the weekend of Thanksgiving or the second week of December, because that's when all the leaves have finally fall. And that's true each and every year. Here they are having this harvest at this time of the year, because that's when all the harvest now is taken up, every bit of it. So now they can have actually a celebration, because the Feast of Tabernacles, it deals with the end of the harvest is taken up, but also it deals with some other things that come into place here too. Now, this feast is an ideal time now to have it, because of the fact, let me do a celebration. It is now 5 days after the Day of Atonement. Now, we all know the Day of Atonement was about, right? Right? I got a little shaky on this one. I hope you know what it's about, because guess what? I'm not going back over it. But the Day of Atonement, 5 days have passed since that's come about. But see, the Day of Atonement was different from this day. The Day of Atonement, use a play on words, it was more serious. It was more sacred. It was a more solemn day, because that day was a day that you came to ask for forgiveness for your sins. So you had really a burden that was placed upon you. A burden that was placed upon you. Then in that, the priest, before he could even give a sacrifice for your sins, he had to give a sacrifice for his sins, and this for his family. How you can tell somebody else's family gets straight and yours not straight. So he gets his straight. After they're getting that straight, then that burden is now lifted upon you. So now they truly can celebrate. Because remember, the Feast of Tabernacles is all about celebration. And if you got a weight on your shoulder, it's hard to celebrate, isn't it? It's hard to celebrate. Because keep in mind, the Day of Atonement was all about seriousness. You're a sinner. You can't enjoy the blessings of God as you would like, because you know that you are a sinner. But now that you have this burden lifted off you, now you can truly celebrate. A weak analogy that I can give right now is a few weeks ago, Linda and I had to go to my grandmother's sister, the twins, their birthday lunch. And it wasn't their birthday. Birthday was for like a week and a half later. But to surprise them, the family got together and said, we're going to have a lunch, dinner, however you want to look at that, in Fredericksburg. Go to Fredericksburg, I think it was about 30 of us in a room, having a good time, talking with them, and so on and so on. It comes to an end, the meal, and when a meal comes in a restaurant, what comes next? Not quite. There you go, Millie. The bill comes. Well, the bill comes, Carol, and they put the bill on the table, and this is what I do. I go, wait a minute. I look at Linda and I said, I don't have my wallet. My better half does this. Yeah, right. But I don't have it. I look on the floor, I look around. I said, well, I did sit out front for a minute. I went up front, couldn't find it. Walked to the car, checked the car, didn't have it. Asked the lady at the front desk. Nobody's seen a wallet. So then I started to doubt myself, because I don't carry my wallet on me. I always leave it in the car or something like that. I don't put it in my pocket. I said, well, maybe I did leave it. So I kept wondering about it. I said, where's my wallet at? So anyway, I said, well, you guys accept Apple Pay? I said, yeah. So great. Paid and was done. But here's the thing. We left there to go to my cousin's house, who was having a 50th birthday cookout. Brothers and sisters there, family there, having a good time fellowshipping. But I couldn't celebrate something like I wanted to. Whole time I'm thinking, let me turn my bank cards off. I got my driver's license in there. I got my state inspection license in there. my voter registration card in there. What did I do with that wallet? So you couldn't celebrate like you wanted to celebrate because it was like a burden on you. Luckily, later on that evening, I guess it was about close to 9 o'clock, Lynn said, why don't you call the restaurant again and just see if somebody found it? Call up there. They said, well, we have a black wallet, but I don't know who it is because the manager has locked it in the office. But we'll call you tomorrow and see if it's yours because we closed at 10 o'clock. And it was 9 o'clock then, in Fredericksburg. Let me tell you something. I didn't know that white car ass go so fast. I flew up that road and I got there before they closed. And luckily it was, thank the Lord, it's my wallet. But guess what? It was a weight lifted off you. Now, if that had been done earlier, I could truly have celebrated in the fashion that I wanted to. Here, the children of Israel now have the opportunity to celebrate 5 days since the Day of Atonement, which was a serious day. Now God says, it's a Feast of Tabernacles. It's time for you to, guess what? Celebrate. I told you earlier, in Deuteronomy, God even ordered it, that you are to rejoice and to celebrate. Now, it says here, and this is the 7th month shall be the Feast of Tabernacles for 7 days unto the Lord. Tabernacles, called the Feast of Tabernacles. This is a tough question here, unless you've really studied. What are the 3 names of this festival? I don't know if anybody studied that or not. It has 3 different names. And the reason why I bring them up, because sometimes you'll find that a message is given over the pulpit, and they'll mention that name, or mention these names, and you're going, well, which feast are they talking about? Well, it's the same feast, just has 3 different names. The first name originally was called the Feast of Ingathering, because it's all about gathering up the crops and the gathering of the people coming together. Because you remember, everybody just came to town for the Day of Atonement. Now it's 5 days later, it's time now to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. So initially, it was known as the Feast of Ingathering. Some call it the Feast of Booths. And then you have what's known today as the Feast of Tabernacles. Booth and tabernacles kind of mean the same thing. It's like a dwelling, a tent that's put up. I think the Hebrew term might be something like sakaf, which we would call today in our history, guess what? A brush arbor. Not a brush harbor, because that's where the boats park at, but a brush arbor. Because if you read in this lesson, they talk about cutting down the tree branches and the limbs and setting things up where they would set up in a tent outside. So the Feast of Tabernacles, really, folks, it's all about you would go back to the time which you came out of Egypt, because they lived in these booths, in these tabernacles, in these brush arbors, as they wandered, you could say, in the wilderness. So the calling of this feast was all about also, not just gathering up the harvest, it was about going back and thinking of how God sustained you to bring you where it is you are. So they would go back for 7 days and lived in the manner in which they came up. Just to remember, say, Lord has brought me truly a long ways. Now, even today it's celebrated that certain orders of the Jews will put booths or tents in their yard, and they would camp out. Because we might think that initially off the top of our head, this is a hard time. Who wants to go back and live like that? But really for them, it was a celebration because everybody did it. You planned it for the whole year. It's like a giant camp out. It's like a giant gathering of folks where they stayed out in the doors for that whole entire week. But keep in mind, for all those days, they celebrated. So I'll get ahead of myself. When you had those burnt offerings, sometimes the burnt offering would be consumed entirely. But in most cases, you would give a sacrifice unto God, then they would eat the meat. So all it is, they're cooking on the grill. If you want to think about it, they gave their blessing to the Lord, and they partied and had a great time of celebration for an entire week, and they looked forward to it. Just imagine, well, someone might think about the cost over the happiness of it. Just imagine celebrating Thanksgiving for an entire week. Just imagine the kids, especially when we were coming up, for a whole week you celebrate Christmas. It was one of their most joyous times. It was one of the only feasts that they were mandated to celebrate. The harvest is done, the work is done, you not to work, just come out, everybody move back in their tents and have a good time. But one of the things I would like to bring up is they had to go back and think about what they came through and how God brought them to where they are. We talk about that in here. Who in here would want to go back and live like they did coming up? Most of us said, no, not me. But isn't it interesting how we think about it? We always celebrate it. We say, I can remember when. This is what we did, so-and-so and so-and-so. Always something fun, but when you think about it now, it's like, well, it wasn't fun when I was doing it, but now you can celebrate it. Folks will tell you quick, oh, I can remember when gas was 75 cents a gallon. I'm like, yeah, but you weren't making I guess you call it, what is it, rate of cost of living, rate of inflation. You weren't making the same thing you is now and paying cheap prices back then. You had to go through some things. Hold on a second. Let me just look something up here. Quiz you guys. Oops. I'm gonna go back to the 60s. I think most identify with that and how much things were in the 60s. How much do you think a gallon of gas was in 1960? Gas back then was 25 cents. And by 1969, inflation kicked in, it moved up to 35 cents. Sounds cheap, doesn't it? Sounds cheap. What's the cost of a new house on average today? What's the average cost of a house today? All right, I'm hearing six figures. Back then, the average cost of a new house, it says here, was $12,700. 4 years later, inflation kicked in. It's now cost you a whopping $15,000 for a house. Things were cheap back then. If you think about it today versus then, what do you think people made? You know how we talk, oh, I can remember you could take a dime and buy a whole bag of Ginger Snap cookies. Cookies like to break your teeth off. Y'all remember those days? What was the average cost, you think, average income for 1 year back in the 60s? Dick Bush? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, back then, the average income, $5,300 for the entire year. So when you start talking about gas, 25 cents a gallon, and things of that nature, it gets pretty expensive, don't it? You're living a hard life. Go a little bit further. Wallace, you can identify with this one. The average pair of a men's pair of shoes, $12.95. Oh, you make the money you do now, you go in the store, so give me 5 pair right now. $12.95 for a men's pair of shoes. The minimum wage was $1.25. Gas 25 cents a gallon, you only made $1.25 an hour. You see what I'm getting at here? So when you go back to think about those days, don't think about how rough it was. You got to think, as the children of Israel did, think of what God has brought you through to be where it is you are now. Because if we go back to where we came from, we all know some of us now wouldn't have central air. Somebody else wouldn't have a heat pump or gas heat. Some of us wouldn't have running water in the house. You don't have running water, guess what you don't have in the house? You won't have a bathroom in the house. Mm-hmm. Some of you might not have a vehicle to get to church today. I mean, the list goes on and on and on and on. But when you think back, we only say one thing: look how far the Lord has brought us. And that was the purpose of this celebration, to look back how you came up, to see how God had brought you all the way to where you are at now. Because remember, they were slaves. They lived in the wilderness. And then they lived in their own land. Remember, God told them, said, the day going to come where you're going to move into houses that you didn't even build. And remember, at this point, they were living in a brush arbor. He said, you're going to live in houses you didn't build. You're going to drink water from wells you didn't even dig. You're going to eat food out of gardens that you didn't even plant. But he also told them this. He said, then your stomach shall be filled and you shall be fat. And he said these sad words, then you're going to forget all about me. And unfortunately, that was true. And even today, some folks had come from a long ways. And they was coming up and said, Lord, if you only bring me through this one. But after they got there, Wallace, they forgot all about the Lord after that. But here, this celebration was put in place so they could remember all that God had truly done for them, and they were mandated to celebrate. It said, for 7 days unto the Lord. But then it says on 35, on the first day shall be a holy convocation, and you shall do no serving work therein. Know what it's saying here? You got to celebrate the Lord, right? But it also knows you don't celebrate him any kind of way. You follow what I'm getting at? He didn't say it's a free fall, get up on the table, drunk, party, that kind of, no. It said there's a way to carry this thing out. The first day, it said it was a holy convocation. And to get ahead of myself, because like I said, I'm not going through each one of these verses to the end, I don't think, but the first day and the eighth day, if you look at your lesson, they're talking about the Sabbaths. They said Sabbath. You were to consider the first day and the eighth day as if it was a Sabbath day. Now, somebody said, wait a minute. They said celebrate for 7 days. Where do 8 days come in at? Well, you celebrate for 7 days, but on the eighth day, you remember back the celebration itself, but treat it as a Sabbath day. So God says, celebrate. Have a good time. Rejoice. And he mandated it, but he said, but you have to do this thing in decency and in order. And that's how you celebrate. You know, you look at David. When David danced in the street for the Lord, what did his wife say? Mm-hmm. She basically pulled him down like, you common folks. You common folks. Is anything wrong with dance for the Lord? Do you see it in the church? Yeah, you see it in the church. Anytime people get up and dance and walk the aisles, whatever it may be, nothing wrong with celebrating for the Lord. 152 years. Did we celebrate last week? Did we dance? I wish I could dance. I don't want to do it myself. But I don't want to embarrass myself going out there, you know. But in other words, but you did it in decency and in order. Nothing wrong with dancing for the Lord. I was hoping that Dietrich had more time to play music long before that. Because as the pastor said way back when this thing started, he said, we want to do what? Celebrate. We want to have a good time in the Lord. But you know what gets me? Is folks who will say something such as, you shouldn't do this and shouldn't do that in the church. But then you go up the road to somebody else cooking and do the same thing. Like God doesn't see you there too. But it's the way in which you do things. Here God said to celebrate it, but here is the way you ought to celebrate it. Because remember, this is also what's called the law. The law told them what they couldn't do, but also told them what they ought to do. And I always like this festival because one of the things he commanded was, I command you to rejoice and celebrate it. You know, it wasn't one of those solemn days where they had to light the certain incense offering and the priest had to come in and so on. You did those things leading up to it, but then after that, God says, have a good time. You worked hard all year. Enjoy the blessings that I have placed upon you. It's like Solomon said in the third chapter. He said, vanities are vanities. All is vanity. He said, what is life? He said, I've got much, but when I die, somebody else is going to spend it. He said, I have homes, but when I go away from here, somebody else is going to live in them. He said, I gave many speeches, but who can remember my words? He said, so what is the point of life? He said, in the end, just to enjoy all the blessings God has given you and live life to the fullest. And all this God is telling his people in there, enjoy yourselves, because I brought you a mighty, mighty long way. Then in verse 36, he says, 7 days you shall offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord. On the 8th day shall be an holy convocation unto you, and you shall offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord. It is a solemn assembly, and you shall do no servine work therein. So in other words, he says, on the 8th day, it's going to be like the first day. It's going to be a day of Sabbath, a day of worship and respect unto God, and no one is to do what? No work. And that means, guess what? Everybody. Nobody's doing any work. Even if someone was a servant in your home, that was one day the servant could tell you, you get it yourself, because I'm off today, because God had mandated it. Because this celebration, you'll find back in verse 34, it says, speak unto the children of Israel. The celebration was for who? Children of Israel. But were the children of Israel the ones that came out of Egypt? You'll find when you read in other chapters, it was primarily for the children of Israel, but there were other people who came out also. I showed you in previous lessons how when they came out of Egypt, the Egyptians had more slaves than just the children of Israel. There were other people, but they all partook in it. But God's saying, this is for you, but other people will receive the blessing from it. To tie it in with the celebration of last week, who was the anniversary for? It was for us. Was anyone else invited? Yeah, because it's a time of what? Celebration. Now, I can't stress it enough because that's what this feast is all about. This is the only feast that I know of that it only talks about doing one thing. Praise God for what it is you have and celebrate. He says this is celebration. You go on. I'll tell you, I'm jumping to the end now. Verse 42. I'm just going to skip over the law. I'm going to close this thing out. It says, ye shall dwell in booths 7 days. All that are Israelites born shall dwell in booths, that your generations may know that I made the children of Israel to dwell in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So what God is saying here in this feast is that you are to dwell in these booths for 7 days. All the children of Israel to just remember what it is I have done for you, how I have brought you out. So it's a celebration, once again, for everybody to take part in, everyone to enjoy it. But one of the key things he says here is this last thing. He writes it for a reason. He writes it that they may not know how to carry out the ceremony, but most importantly, why they're doing it in the first place. That's the key. This is why you're doing it, because I brought you out. Every one of their ceremonies typically has something to do with God. The Passover, we know what that was about. God said, I want you to remember, this is how you came out of Egypt. And the list goes on, because there's several other feasts they have, Feast of Pentecost and so on from there. All those play similar roles, but there was a purpose behind them. One of the key things I've always liked about the children of Israel is that each and every celebration they had, they knew why they were celebrating it in the first place. This is why each time we have a special day that comes up, I like to always give the history. Now, someone say, why are you getting the history? We already know that. Well, guess what? Repetition is the mother of learning. This is why each and every year they celebrate each and every year, but Moses would write it out. This is what you are to do. Then we say, speak it unto your children, teach it to them that they may know it, then they can carry it to someone else. But it wasn't oral history. It was written out. Because you remember, even when the people said in the previous lesson that dealt with promise of obedience, or obedience in promise, that one. They said they're gonna follow everything the Lord said, right? What did Moses did? He wrote all of it down. Then he said he came back and he read it all to them and said, this is what you're gonna do? And they once again said, we're gonna do everything that the Lord has required of us. And then they still did with a sacrifice, because they had the history written down. And here you'll find in this particular scripture, as the Bible is a book of history, but it's not also a book of information, but it's primarily written for transformation. Here you'll find Moses has penned this in history that they may always remember why they are celebrating. Why they are celebrating what's called the Feast of Tabernacles. Now I'm going to give you my last question, and we're closing out about 5 minutes early today. What is the name of these three? What are the 3 names of this festival? What's the 3 names? Because sometimes people will be in the pulpit talking, they say, you have the Feast of so-and-so, and the Feast of such and such. It's all one feast, but it has 3 different names. Anybody know what they were? Ingathering, booths, and tabernacles. Now, what was this? This the hard one. What was the Hebrew name? That's the month. That's the 7th month, the 15th day they were celebrated. And their term, they call it Tishra. But what is the term that they use? Well, ingathering is right, booths is right, tabernacle is right, but there's a Hebrew word that they use that I butchered when I first spoke it. I think they spell it something like Sukuoth, something like Sakaf. If you ever hear that term, this is on the radio, that's just basically speaking of, guess what, the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Ingathering. It's all one and the same, just that over the generations, the name had changed somewhat as time went on. Such as the term, I see it slowly going the people of God's way. When we talk about Easter, more people now, they know what Easter, well, we all know what Easter is all about. But also we know what the Resurrection Sunday is all about. I notice now more and more church folks, bit by bit, are saying, oh, Resurrection Sunday. I like when I hear that term, because that's what we celebrate, Resurrection Sunday. There is a difference between Easter and Resurrection Sunday, but we'll cover that when that comes around again. But next week's lesson, folks, we open up a new theme, which is obedience in society. And this one here, we might do verse 1, because it has a lot of stuff that we all can identify with and have something to say on. I mean, I'll give you an example. It says here, thou shalt not raise a false report. What does that mean? You don't lie, Not raise a false report. Put not thy hand with the wicked to be an unrighteous witness. Now, we can talk for hours on that. 2 said, thou shalt not follow a multitude to do evil. Neither shalt thou speak in a cause to decline after many to wrest judgment. Neither shalt thou countenance a poor man in his cause. Verse 4 says, if thou meet thine enemy's ox or his ass going astray, thou shalt surely put it back to him again. Some of y'all saying, yeah, right. I'm going to give it back. All right, it's mine now. But that's what I'm getting at. We have a lot to talk about this week, a lot to talk about of how this plays in today. And, of course, we know, oh, my goodness, if it really plays in heaven in this, what's coming up in a couple of weeks on a Tuesday? Election. Have we voted yet? Already voted? There we go. A lot of people already voted. Please vote. You have to vote. I can take a scripture here and pin it to so many different candidates. So many different candidates. And so many other folks. But you'll find that it'll be a great lesson we're dealing with next week. But once again, we're coming out of Exodus next week, the 23rd chapter, starting at verse 1 is where we're coming from. But please get out and vote and encourage others to vote. They still have early voting going on if you want to go, instead of waiting for the last day and beat the crowds.